Okay. Hi, everybody. The This is my first video in quite some time. So uh, some of you know that I had a little accident and I banged my head, and it involved two trips to the hospital and some brain surgery. But I'm happy to say that I'm doing pretty well, and it's time to start making videos again. So The the other thing that's changed is that I'm doing this on a new laptop, and so this is all experimental. I'm not sure how well this is going to work. This is this is a video I made notes for it before I banged my head, and so now I'm going to use those notes to make a video. And this video is about Buddhism, which some of you know has had some influence on me. Um, I should point out that, it's not really like a religion for me. Buddhism can be thought of as a religion, um, but for me, it's more just a psychological practice. It's not something that I believe in. It's something that I practice, or I should say that I try to practice. And we're going to talk, there's many different branches of Buddhism. Now, usually when people start talking about religion, um, people tend to shy away from that because um, usually when people talk to you about their religion, they're talking to you about a subjective universe that they've overlaid on top of an objective universe. And sometimes this subjective universe doesn't really correlate exactly with the objective universe. So, religion, for a lot of people, their perception of it is that it involves believing in things that aren't true or that are probably not true. And and so if somebody comes up to you and says, "Well, I want to talk about religion," like your first thought is, "Well, okay, say if this makes somebody happy or if it makes somebody feel good, then that's fine." But you also sort of wonder about it. It's sort of like, is it sort of a break with reality? And you can sort of think of it as like a child might have an imaginary friend. And when you see a child that has an imaginary friend, you thought, well, okay, well, this imaginary friend probably fills some psychological need that they have, but the need is sort of satisfied by having a break with reality because the imaginary friend is not really there. And so most religions are actually based on this. So sort of a cognitive dissonance, like a belief in something that may or may not be true. I don't want to get too harsh, and um, the subjective reality involved in religion is sometimes not congruent with an objective reality of what's really happening in the universe. And I'm trying to avoid that, but we all have a subjective reality. We all have like a sort of image of the universe that we impose on top of the objective reality. And there are people who treat Buddhism as a religion. We're going to talk about different aspects or different types of Buddhism. And some are more inclined to have a subjective universe um, that may involve a pantheon of deities or semi-deities um, that, in my view, probably don't exist, but I can't say for sure, and are probably just allegorical representations of something within us, sort of the best parts of our own self. So that's sort of how I view it. I'm actually pretty secular. If the story involves strange miracles that override the laws of physics, I'm extremely skeptical. Um, and however, my own view of Buddhism is that it's not a belief system, or at least not for me. Um, but it's not something that I believe in. It's rather something that I practice, and we'll talk more about that. In any case, the this talk is going to be primarily academic in the sense that I'm going to tell you about Buddhism. It doesn't mean that you need to convert to Buddhism or believe in it or anything else. And there's parts of it that I don't believe in. So um, that's fine. Whatever your subjective universe is, I don't think that my subjective universe is better than anyone else's. Um, but in my view, Buddhism is a practice that attempts to overcome subjective universes, to go beyond subjective universes, and to see the true objective universe, which may not be what you think it is. And uh, that to me is the goal of Buddhism, is to awaken to an objective. So I'm more in the school of mindfulness and um, the the sort of a more modern practice of Buddhism. Um, but in any case, let me go ahead and start. I've got my notes here. So this is about Buddhism, and of course, a lot of this is stuff that you already know. But let me let me just get into it the way I wrote my notes, and we'll see how it goes from there. So the the this whole thing is divided into three parts. The first part is the story of Buddha's life, so it's the story. And then the second part is the basic teachings of Buddhism. And then the third part will be a history of the different types of Buddhism and sort of how they formed. So we'll start with the story, and this is stuff that a lot of you already know, but be patient with me, and we'll get to the rest of it. Actually, and the teachings are also something that a lot of you may already be familiar with, but some of you may not, and so I'm going to go ahead and start now with the story. And the story goes as follows. About 2,500 years ago, in a land that is now Nepal, a child named Siddhartha was born as a prince in the Gautama clan, and hence was referred to as Siddhartha Gautama. And the story is that when he was born, it was prophesied that he would either be a great king or a great spiritual leader. And his father, who was the king, wanted him to be a king. So he tried to make a life for him that had no suffering and thus would make him less inclined to be spiritual. And the story goes that his father confined him to a palace with a sheltered life, with many pleasures, and only allowed him to see young, healthy, and happy people. He was also married at a young age and had a child. And the story continues that at some point he managed to escape and was driven in a chariot to see the world outside the palace. And he saw an old person for the first time and was disturbed by this. And he asked the driver of the chariot what was wrong with that person. And the driver explained to him this was old age, and it would happen to everyone, including him. Later, he saw a sick person and was also disturbed by that, and asked the driver of the chariot what was going on. And the driver explained to him this was sickness, and it could happen to anyone. And Siddhartha was suddenly disillusioned with his life. Oh, he also saw a corpse, and the driver explained to him that everyone dies. And Siddhartha was suddenly disillusioned with his life. And then, when he saw a religious ascetic, he decided to abandon his life as a prince and also become a religious ascetic. Okay, and so for years, he practiced fasting and bodily mortifications, trying to overcome his dissatisfaction with life, but he was not successful. And one day, he simply gave up and sat under a tree and determined that he would not move until he found what he was looking for. The story is that he then became enlightened, and he stood up from the tree and went on to teach what he had learned in this process of awakening or this process of enlightenment. And his teachings are summarized. I'm going to summarize his teachings now, what he came out and taught. So a lot of the Buddhist teachings, like you have to realize they were not written down at the time of the Buddha's life, but were written down a couple centuries afterwards. And a lot of the teachings, it's sort of like it's sort of like internet clickbait, like where you see like, you know, 12 Hollywood stars and where they are today, and there's always like these numbered lists. And in Buddhism, there's also like a lot of numbered lists. And the two that we're going to look at are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Now, the reason for these numbered lists is I think that when this was part of an oral tradition, having numbered lists made it easier to memorize the teachings. So if you have four noble truths, then when you're talking about them, you won't forget and only do three or only do two or whatever. And so his teaching started out with the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is it's a little hard to translate, but it says life involves suffering. Uh, the actual Sanskrit word is dukkha, and it's not quite suffering, but it's dissatisfaction or unsatisfactory. And so what essentially is it saying is that the nature of life is to be unsatisfactory. And so this is considered kind of like, negative, like this is interesting way to start a religion by saying, life is crap, or I don't think he meant it quite that way. Um, life has various degrees of dissatisfaction, but in general, there's always a little bit of dissatisfaction involved in life. And his second noble truth was that this dissatisfaction is caused by wanting things to be different from the way they are. And so this is his second truth, and it's usually translated as that the cause of suffering is desire. But I think a better way of expressing it is that dissatisfaction with life is caused by wanting things to be different from the way they are. And this brings us to the third noble truth, which is where uh, the teaching starts to take on a tone of optimism. And the third noble truth is there is a way out of this dissatisfaction. And so, um, what the Buddha is sort of saying is that, life is not that great. Um, remember, he started his whole path when he saw an old person and a sick person and a dead person, and realized that this was likely to happen to him as well. And so this made his life in the palace less meaningful. And so this is how he started out, with this feeling of dissatisfaction with life. But then, and that was the first noble truth. And the second noble truth was that the cause of it is wanting things to be different from the way they actually are. And then the third noble truth is that there is a way out of this dissatisfaction. And so here he's taking on a sort of more optimistic view of things. And this is something that he came up with after his awakening. So there was something that he experienced sitting under. It was under a tree. It was under a Bodhi tree that he sat, and he wasn't going to move until he found the answer to his dissatisfaction. And when he came out, he was awoken, and he was asked, like who are you? And it says apparently he had some charisma or aura to him. And like I said, this is the story. I wasn't there, so I don't know what he actually looked like. But somebody asked him, like, who are you? Are you a god? Are you an angel? And he says, no, I'm just a person who has awoken. And from this, he came up with the third noble truth, and that there is a way out of suffering or a way out of a dissatisfactory life. And that was the third noble truth. And then his fourth noble truth was that the way out of suffering is the Eightfold Path. And so one of these numbered lists leads into another numbered list. And so he he then gets to the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path, just to to summarize it, uh, and they're usually represented in a wheel, so there's no particular order, but I have to give them in some order, and this is the order they're usually given in, is the the Eightfold Path is right understanding. So to understand to understand, you know, well, right understanding, whatever that is. And the second one is right thought. And there is a quote from him that everything we are is made up of thoughts. Um, the third one is right speech, to to say the right things. And I think there are certain criteria. It has to be it has to be true. What you say has to be true, and what you say, it has to not just be true, but it also has to be kind. So saying something to somebody just because it's true but it's unkind would not be considered right speech. Now, I want to clarify at this point that I'm not claiming that I do all these things. I'm just doing this academically. I'm telling you what they are. So the fourth element in the Eightfold Path is right action. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's right livelihood. So the way of making a living, you should have the right way of making a living. And then the sixth one is right effort, and then comes right mindfulness. And we'll talk a little more about that. And then the last one is right concentration. Okay, so then there was an article in a Buddhist magazine called Tricycle, and the article was written by, I'm going to butcher this name, Walpola Sri Rahula, and he says that the Eightfold Path can be classified in three categories. The first category is ethical behavior, and the ethical behavior involves right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And so those are grouped into a category of ethical behavior. And then the second category is mental discipline, and that includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And then the third group, and this is something, this is something from an article in a magazine. So I don't know if the Buddha classified them like this or not, but I think it's kind of interesting. And the last group is wisdom, which involves right understanding and right thought. So let's go through some of these. Let's talk about the ethical behaviors ones. So you have right speech, and I talked about that, and this is again from the article in the Tricycle magazine, um, and it says right speech means abstention from telling lies and from backbiting and slander and talk that may bring out hatred and enmity, disunity, and disharmony among individuals or groups. Um, and also means avoiding harsh, rude, impolite, malicious, and abusive language. And four, avoiding idle, foolish, useless, and foolish babble and gossip. And essentially, it says that one should not speak carelessly. And if one can't say something that's useful, one should keep a noble silence. And this is something that I have a problem with. Um, I tend to talk about idle and useless things and foolish babble and gossip. So um, I want to make this clear that I'm not saying that I've done all this. It's more something that I aspire to. And this lecture is academic, so I'm just trying to tell you um, about something. I'm not preaching to you or telling you that I've accomplished all this. And so in the ethical behavior group is right action. And right action aims at promoting moral, honorable, and peaceful conduct. It admonishes us to abstain from destroying life, from stealing, from dishonest dealings, from illegitimate sexual intercourse, and we should also help others to find a peaceful and honorable life in the right way. And again, this is not something that I have accomplished. You know, um, something that comes to mind. We were in an RV park in a place called Sapanero, and there was some heavy rains, and so there were some fields around our coach that apparently had a lot of mice. And the mice, when the heavy rains came, I guess their burrows in this field got flooded, and so they needed a place to go. And so the some of them decided that coming into our coach would be a good place to go. And that's a bit of a problem, because if you have mice in your coach, they leave little droppings around, and it's not sanitary, and my wife will not tolerate it. And somehow it fell on me to do something about it. And um, I tried. There were some humane traps that sort of caught them alive. They weren't as effective. They were more expensive than the traps, the old-fashioned traps where the little spring comes and breaks their neck and kills them. But it it was also it turned out not to be that humane because the mice would get caught in these traps, the humane traps, and there was at least one that I got to in time, and I went and I walked about 100 yards into a field and turned it loose, hoping that it wouldn't find its way back to the coach. But a number of them sort of died in the traps. They weren't physically hurt, but they struggled for some time and then sort of passed because they didn't have food and water and stuff. And so it seemed that that was less humane than the other traps, which just sprang a spring and instantly killed them. So anyway, so like I say, I'm not perfect, and so um, I've got a bunch of I got a bunch of mice on my conscience because we found out how they were getting into the coach. They were coming in through the battery compartment, and so I laid a bunch of traps on top of the battery compartment, and they we a couple a day were getting killed. Then we bought some lights. It turns out they don't like bright lights. So I bought a big 500-watt light and I put it under the battery compartment, and they stopped coming because they'd come at night and they don't like to be in bright light. So anyway, so I'm not, again, I'm not saying I'm trying to do this academically. I'm not trying to preach. I'm just telling you this is the teachings of Buddhism, uh, and I'm not claiming to be sort of perfect in my practice of this, but it's something that I aspire to. The third item in the ethical behavior group is right livelihood. And right livelihood means that one should abstain from making one's living through a profession that causes harm to others, such as trading in arms and lethal weapons, intoxicating drinks or poisons, killing animals, cheating, etc., and should live by a profession which is honorable, blameless, and innocent of harm to others. One can clearly see here that Buddhism is strongly opposed to any kind of war when it lays down that trade in arms and evil weapons is evil and unjust means of livelihood. Okay, so yeah, I'm not not sure. There have been cases. There's currently I forget the name of it, but there's a uh, a Buddhist segment of in Southeast Asia that's waging war on Muslims, and so I'm not sure about that. And then there was an emperor who converted to Buddhism, Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, and he did still he is the one responsible for spreading Buddhism in the same way that Paul was responsible for spreading Christianity. Um, and yet, as an emperor, he still had to have an army, and so I'm not sure about this. And while I don't trade in arms and lethal weapons, um, I do have a couple pistols, and I'm planning on getting a rifle. So it's not, and it should be pointed out that the Shaolin monks, of the famous Shaolin monks who started martial arts, were Buddhists, and so I don't know. I don't know about weapons. I think there's probably some fine line about when when, a weapon could be used defensively, or, or might be used to prevent a greater harm. Um, and like I say, I'm not an expert, or I'm not, you know, my joke in Sapanero, when I was talking to people, I was telling, well, I'm a Buddhist, but I'm killing all these mice. But that's the advantage of not being a good Buddhist. Um, that you have to make some decisions. And I got into a discussion with some Buddhist monks in Orlando about whether or not it was okay to kill mosquitoes. And and my argument was that if you don't kill a mosquito and then it gives malaria to somebody else and then they die, then it's sort of your inaction was responsible for for a greater loss than killing a mosquito. But in any case, so I'm just telling you what the teachings are, and I think it's something that we can all think about. Um, and I'm sure that some people may not agree with my viewpoints, and that's fine. So anyway, that completes the part of the Eightfold Path that has to do with ethical behavior. And then there's three items in the section of mental discipline. And so the first is right effort. And it describes here from again from the magazine article in the Tricycle magazine that right effort is the energetic will, one, to prevent evil and unwholesome states of mind from arising, and two, to get rid of such evil and unwholesome states that have already arisen, and also to produce and cause to arise good and wholesome states of mind not yet arisen, and to develop and bring to perfection the good and wholesome states of mind already present in a man. Okay, well, that sounds good. It, and I think we're starting to we're starting to refer to um, the mental disciplines, and so we're talking about meditation. And um, again, this is turning into like a confession for me. Um, I'm not sure that I actually put in the right amount of effort in my meditation practice. So I've had periods of my life when I was very sort of rigid and rigorous about practicing meditation. Um, and I'm not sure that that always works. So there's something about, just being too insistent about meditation. And so I'm sort of at a point where um, I just sort of let meditation arise when it wants to. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but I find myself sort of slipping into meditation as opposed to sort of forcing myself into meditation. And and I don't know. I don't know, if that's the right way to do it, but that's the way I'm doing it. And I don't know if that's what's right way for other people to do it. Uh, but the last part of this, to develop and bring to perfection the good and wholesome states of mind already present. Mm, so I don't know what that means, but it does take some effort. You have to decide, well, I'm going to sit and meditate. And the sitting and meditating, we've talked about this. It can be boring. You can sit there, and if it's boring, you're probably not really meditating. But then again, it's hard to say. Meditating is not something you can sort of willfully do. Um, but we're going to come to that because that's our next section here. It's going to be uh, right mindfulness, I think. Let me just see my notes. Yes, right mindfulness is the next topic in this section of the Eightfold Path that this person in the Tricycle magazine has separated into these three categories of ethical behavior, mental discipline, and wisdom. So let's see what he says about right mindfulness. And okay, so this is kind of a long one. Um, right mindfulness is to be diligently aware, mindful, and attentive with regard to one, the activities of the body, two, sensations or feelings, three, the activity of minds, and four, the ideas, thoughts, and conceptions and things related to the teachings of the Buddha. I'm not sure about that, but he goes on in the next paragraph, and this is probably something I'll agree more with. He goes, the practice of concentration on breathing, anapanasati, that's the Sanskrit word for concentration on breathing, is one of the well-known exercises connected with the body for mental development. And And there are several other ways of developing attentiveness in relation to the body as modes of meditation. And it's kind of interesting. I did a talk on Zoom with a group, a very nice group, the uh, Raja Muffins, uh, on anapanasati, which is concentration on the breathing. And in the sutta that I was quoting, apparently, the Buddha said that this practice of concentration on breathing is sufficient to bring someone to enlightenment. And so that's been sort of the focus of my spiritual practice is the meditation and concentration on breathing. And it's something fairly easy to do and sometimes produces a very rewarding um, feeling. So uh, sort of pleasant. Uh, but in this particular article on mindfulness, mindfulness is more than just concentration on breathing. It's sort of just being aware of everything that's happening right now in the present. And so it's sort of getting out of your head, stop worrying about the past, stop worrying about the future, and just concentrate on the current now. What is what is going on right now? What is going on around you right now? What is going on inside you right now? Like what thoughts you're having right now? Um, the and sort of a detached awareness of these things. So to be aware of what's happening right now is is probably my best explanation for mindfulness. The and I got here that he's referred to the Sati Patthana Sutta, which is a Buddhist writing about setting up of mindfulness. That's the translation of Sati Patthana, and so it's sort of a how-to. And I've got some sort of link here, but it's not leading anywhere. But if if you wanna if you wanna look up more details, you could search on the web for Sati Patthana Sutta, spelled Sapatthana, Sutta, spelled Sutta. So if you search for that, you probably find this sutta, which is sort of it's sort of instructions on how to meditate. Um, and I think it's particularly meditation on the breath, but I could be wrong. Okay, so that's right mindfulness. And then the last one in this category of mental discipline is right concentration. Now, right mindfulness is something that you sort of do all the time. You're just sort of aware exactly of what's happening around you. And right concentration is um, it's sort of sitting and doing a mental discipline. Um, and here I'll read from this guy's article. So, leading to the four stages of Dhyana, I can't pronounce it, but it's Dhyana. Dhyana? Okay, whatever. And these are referred to as sort of like trance states. So they're states of mind, um, and I'll just describe what this person says about them. So in the first stage, passionate desires and certain unwholesome thoughts like sensuous lust, ill will, languor, worry, restlessness, and skeptical doubt are discarded, and feelings of joy and happiness are maintained, along with certain mental activities. So this is just sort of a stage where you're a little calmer and uh, you're still having mental activity. And then he refers to the second stage. All intellectual activities are suppressed. Tranquility and one-pointedness of mind develop, and the feelings of joy and happiness are still retained. And so when you're in meditation, you can get to sort of a deep stage where you're not thinking about anything. It's just sort of a silence, sort of a mental silence that takes place inside your head. And so, um, and it's a pleasant state. I, you know, it's very nice when it happens. I can't control it. Like sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. Uh, you can't worry about that. You can't like sit and say, oh, you know, I'm still thinking about stuff. That's okay. That's the nature of things. But you keep bringing your attention back to the breath. And then at a certain point, you're just focused on the breath and you're just sort of like riding up and down with your breath, the in breath and the out breath, the in breath and the out breath. And the way I like to think of it is like you become like a child on a seesaw, and the child is just going up and down on the seesaw with, somebody else at the other end, and they're just bouncing up and down, and they're sort of in a childlike state where they're not thinking about anything. Um, they're just enjoying riding up and down on the seesaw. And so it's similar to that, but with the breath. Um, Another way is like a child on a swing. They go back and forth and back and forth, and they they may find this, to be a very pleasant experience, and they're not concerned with anything else, and they're just totally absorbed in riding on this swing. And so essentially, you're trying to get to sort of the same state, um, by concentrating on the breath, or I don't know. Other people have other forms of meditation, and that's fine. The the analogy that I've used is like, say you're snowboarding and you're going down a mountain. So you may be weaving back and forth on a trail while you snowboard, but at that point, you know, you, I don't know how fast snowboarders go, but it's pretty fast. And you're not thinking about anything at that point. You're just absorbed in the process of snowboarding. And so you're concentrating on what you're currently doing, but not in a rigid sort of way. You're not there going, "Oh, I must focus on my snowboarding." It just sort of happens. And that's sort of like how meditation um, should work, but it doesn't always work like that. And it takes some practice. So you got to sit there for some time just with a lot of thoughts, and then keep bringing your attention back to your breath, but then it wanders away again. And so this is probably where the right effort comes in, because um, I mean, who knows? There's two different schools of Zen Buddhism that I'm going to talk about later, and one of them sort of says that you gradually reach enlightenment, and the other one says that enlightenment is sort of an immediate and almost unexpected um, thing that happens. And I think they're probably both right to some degree. Um, in any case, so let me go on. He's going over the four stages of jhana. I think it's pronounced jhana. I've heard it pronounced jhana, but it's spelled Dhyana, but I think it's pronounced jhana. Um, so, and he's explained the second stage is where all intellectual activities are suppressed. Uh, Tranquility and one-pointedness of mind develop, and the feelings of joy and happiness are still retained. And now we're getting into the academic point. I'm just telling you what he's saying in this article. And so he says, in the third stage, the feeling of joy, which is an active sensation, also disappears, while the disposition of happiness still remains, in addition to mindful equanimity. Um, meditation meditation can involve like some interesting experiences where um, it's sort of, you can get to a point where it's like there's nothing, and it's hard to describe this, but I'll just read his description here. So Finally, in the fourth stage of jhana, all sensations, even happiness and unhappiness, of joy and sorrow disappear. Only pure equanimity and awareness remaining. So, um, hmm, I, you know, I don't know, but um, it's interesting. We do seem to get into these numbered lists in Buddhism, um, and so that's right concentration. So that's as opposed to mindfulness, which is something that you would do, like say you were walking on a trail through nature, you'd just be aware of what was on the trail and you stop worrying about, stuff like, do I have a bill to pay next month or stuff like that. Um, so this is right concentration. So this is more of a formal sitting and uh, I don't know about using the term trance states, but I guess it is it is an appropriate name for these things. In any case, it's interesting. So the numbered lists all have nested numbered lists. So the Four Noble Truths had as the last one is the Eightfold Path, and one of those paths is right concentration, and in it lists the four jhanas, sort of the states, the different states of meditation. I'm not sure it can be divided up into just four states. The um, there's a thing in Zen where they go. It's part of a vow that they take, and they go. The gates of enlightenment are infinite, and I vow to pass through all of them. So it's not. I'm not sure it's four. And there may be sub-states within those four states or whatever. I'm not sure. In any case, we come to the last group of the Eightfold Path, which is wisdom, and that involves right understanding and right thought. So let's take a look at right understanding. So, and this is interesting to me because the author here says the right understanding is the understanding of things as they are. And this worries me a little bit because, we all have a subjective reality, and that is our understanding of things as they are. And if you were a Viking in the 1200s, well, your understanding involved, the god Thor and Loki and other gods and stuff, and that was your understanding. And I'm always skeptical of the idea that I understand things as they are, but I'm trying to get to sort of a bare bones understanding. So I think one thing I understand is that people have subjective universes. For example, most religion involves a subjective universe. So you might take someone like myself, and it's like at one time I thought of myself as Christian, and then I had a certain understanding of the universe, and then at another time I thought of myself as, well, it's sort of a branch of Hinduism called Santmat. It's a fairly recent branch of Hinduism, but so I had an understanding of the universe, based on this teachings of Santmat, and now I'm, somewhat of a Buddhist. I think there's plenty of Buddhists who would say I'm not really a Buddhist. Uh, but so that involves like sort of a different understanding. And so now the question is like, and you may know people that have changed from one religion to another religion, or from one branch of Buddhism to another branch of Buddhism. Now, has reality changed, or has the objective universe changed, or is it just the subjective universe that has changed? So the fact that somebody can have a view of the universe, an understanding of things as they are, whatever that is, and the fact that that can change means that it's very ephemeral, and so that's not real. It's not an objective understanding of the universe. And I'm not sure that my views are not subjective, you know. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they are subjective. And so um not sure that my views are any better than anyone else's. But again, I'll just read from the article. And right understanding is the understanding of things as they are. And it is the Four Noble Truths that explain things as they really are. Right understanding, therefore, is ultimately reduced to the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. This understanding is the highest wisdom, which sees the ultimate reality. Okay, well, I don't know. The Okay, it goes on to say, according to Buddhism, there are two sorts of understanding. What we generally call understanding is knowledge, an accumulated memory, an intellectual grasp of a subject according to certain data. This is called knowing. And we could say that this is like an intellectual understanding. So somebody could memorize the Four Noble Truths and could memorize the Eightfold Path, and they could say, sort of like I do, that they know about Buddhism. Um, and this is called knowing accordingly, and there's some Sanskrit word for it, but it's not very deep. Really deep understanding or penetration, and again, there's another Sanskrit word, is seeing things in their true nature without name and label. So this is sort of like a mindfulness, uh, not just an intellectual understanding, but a realization of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Um, and it goes on to say, this penetration is possible only when the mind is free from all impurities and is fully developed through meditation. Okay, so that's nice. That excludes me. But um, but I think there is something to this. I mean, I think right understanding comes at different levels. I think it starts at an intellectual level. Um, it's sort of a view of reality that is intellectual. I think it's an understanding of the difference between objective reality and a subjective reality. And then it goes to another level where that understanding is not intellectual, but it's really sort of a dropping away of any subjective reality and just awareness of the objective reality. If that makes any sense. I don't know. In any case, that's right understanding. It's usually the first of the Eightfold Path. So I think it can be thought of as someone coming to understand Buddhism from a sort of an intellectual point of view, which is what I'm really trying to do with this video. Um, and then realizing, okay, well, this might be something that could be useful in an actual practice or something. Anyway, the after right understanding, in the wisdom category, there's only one other thing, and that's right thought. And this reminds me of um, Science of Mind, and I think Ernest Holmes. We've been going to their meetings every week, and they're very nice people. It's so. Let's see what this author says about right thought. Right thought denotes the thoughts of selfless renunciation or detachment, thoughts of love and thoughts of nonviolence, which are extended to all beings. It's very interesting and important to note here that thoughts of selfless detachment, love, and nonviolence are grouped on the side of wisdom. This clearly shows that true wisdom is endowed with these noble qualities, and that all thoughts of selfish desire, ill will, hatred, and violence are the results of lack of wisdom in all spheres of life, whether individual, social, or political. Okay, so now, then there's the question: can you control your thoughts? Um, and I guess in the Science of Mind group, they actually do control their thoughts. They consciously make aphorisms, like today is going to be a wonderful day. Um, these aphorisms, I'm feeling love and happiness as a thought, uh, and I think there is some benefit to that. Um, and yet, I think the real control of thought is through meditation, uh, and getting to a point where there's no thoughts. But obviously, positive thoughts are better than negative thoughts. And negative thoughts, like, somebody might think, well, I'm not good enough and I'm not, whatever they might think, uh, those are not helpful. And if you have positive thoughts, it is beneficial. And a positive thought, you know, they, y- this is the basis of sort of magic. And there's this thing called the secret. And so you have positive thoughts, whatever they might be, and and sometimes in the case of the secret, it seems a little bit on the selfish side, because you say, well, um, you know, I'm going to have $1 million, and then you believe it, and then the power of having that thought and believing it will actually result in you're getting $1 million. And there is even a branch of Buddhism. It's a, and we'll talk about the different branches of Buddhism in a second, but there's a branch of Buddhism called Pure Lab Buddhism, where, and this is a specific group, um, chants, does the chanting of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And apparently, by doing that chanting, they get everything they want. So, and I was joking around in a group, and I said, well, if you're going to chant something, why don't you chant that? And then you'll get everything you want. And they go, and if you want a new car, you get a new car. And And then somebody asks, "Do you have to pay for the car?" And I go, "Well, you get money too. You get everything." And the point is that if you do that and you believe it, it will probably work. In fact, it will work. There's no doubt about it. This is sort of the basis of positive thinking and the power of belief. And yet it's not, I don't think it's really very well developed spiritually, to go through some magical practice to get a new car and to get money. And so when it comes to the section of right thought, the I have a couple thoughts that I would like to introduce, and I think I've talked about this before. And one of them is that everything that happens for the best. And this, I think, is more enlightened than saying I should have more money. If you believe, and the fact is that it is actually true, so I guess I do believe it, that everything that happens for the best. Well, then you don't have to worry about what you get and what you want and all that stuff, because whatever happens for the best. And so you're sort of surrendering to, and it's actually the fulfillment of the second noble truth, because in the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is dissatisfaction and wanting things to be different from the way they are. But if you say that everything that happens for the best, or I should say, if you realize that everything that happens for the best, then you've sort of overcome suffering to some degree. Um, and so that would be a suggestion for me if you want to have right thoughts. The other thing, and I've talked about this before, is that another right thought is all that stuff is not necessarily true. Okay, so when you say all that stuff is not necessarily true, what does that apply to? Well, it applies to everything. The it applies to the toothpaste commercial on the television. It applies to a politician making promises. Uh, it applies to your own subjective universe. And so that thought that all that stuff is not necessarily true is a way of overcoming your own limited subjective universe and trying to align yourself more with the objective universe. So I don't know if that made sense or not, but that's my last comment on the subject of right thought, which is uh, the last one of the Noble Eightfold Path items that's in the section of wisdom. And so that that does not that does not conclude the entire teachings of Buddhism, but um, it it completes this brief introduction to the teachings of Buddhism. The Now we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Buddhism. So let me see if I can find the right place in my notes. Okay, so the history of Buddhism is that, well, there was Buddha, and he had groups of people, probably a couple thousand, that followed him around and wandered around from village to village, where they kind of lived with the village or camped out in the woods and begged for food and sat and talked and sat and did meditation. So that was a little group that the Buddha had. And we don't really know too much about early Buddhism because nothing was written down um, until a couple centuries later, when the concern was, we've got all these people that have memorized what the different sermons that the Buddha gave, and also memorized all the rules, because as this group that followed Buddha around got bigger and bigger, he started to implement certain rules. And so those rules and also his sermons were, a couple centuries after he died, were written down to make something called the Pali Canon. And we don't know how accurate that is, although it's pretty accurate. We found that oral traditions do pretty well at memorizing things. Um, and that's partly what I talked about earlier, that, everything is made up of numbered lists in order to sort of make sure that nothing gets lost in the oral transmission of these teachings. So that was all written down in something called the Pali Canon, and there is a group, there is a section of Buddhism called Theravada, and they're based on the Pali Canon, and so primarily in Southeast Asia, and there's some in America and Europe as well. Um, but they're based on the original Pali Canons, and then, well, let me see what my notes are. This is a couple months ago that I made these notes. And it just says Buddhism started in Nepal and northern India, and after Buddha's death, his teachings were preserved orally for about 300 years before being written down, and these earliest Buddhist writings are referred to as the Pali Canon because they were written in Pali, which is a dialect of Sanskrit. The earliest, these early writings formed the primary basis for Theravada Buddhism, which is mostly practiced in Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia. Theravada Buddhism emphasizes individual enlightenment and a monastic way of life. So the idea is to really advance in Theravada Buddhism, you have to become a monk. And so that's that's the Theravada Buddhism. So then the next group of Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism was developed in northern India and included the teachings of later Buddhists along with the early canons. It placed a greater emphasis on compassion and the ideal of the bodhisattva, who forgoes enlightenment and compassionately provides spiritual help to others. So this is a contrast to the Theravada Buddhism, which is all about individual enlightenment, and the goal is to become an arhat, and an arhat is someone who's enlightened. Um, and in Mahayana Buddhism, the emphasis is on becoming a bodhisattva, which is someone who has set aside their own enlightenment and is compassionate and helpful to others as opposed to just worrying about themselves. I'm not I'm not I'm not arguing that one's right and one's wrong. I'm just trying to do this academically and tell you about uh, the different forms of Buddhism. So another form of Buddhism is called Vajrayana Buddhism. And the Mahayana Buddhism spread north to Tibet, and the people of Tibet practiced a religion called Bon, which had a large pantheon of benevolent deities and wrathful demons. And when Buddhism came to Tibet, it didn't replace the Bon cosmology, but incorporated the Bon pantheon of deities into the Buddhist teachings. And the stories and the legends are that Buddhist magicians used magical powers to defeat the Bon demons, who then became powerful spiritual protectors of Buddhism. And this form of Buddhism is referred to as the Vajrayana Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. And I've I've gone to some of their meetings. I think they're called the Kadampas, and the Dalai Lama is in this is in this group of Vajrayana Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. And it's interesting, in the Dalai Lama's writings, he seems to be sort of moving towards a secular form of Buddhism, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's I shouldn't say I shouldn't say he's moving to a secular form of Buddhism, but he seems to accept that a secular form of Buddhism might be more palatable to people in the West. Um, so, you know, it does seem like it's a very subjective universe. Um, I talked to a Tibetan Buddhist in New Orleans who talked about there were 13 heavens above the earth and 13 hells below the earth. And I asked him, like, have you seen this? And he admitted that he hadn't seen it, but he'd been told about it by a teacher who he trusted. And I asked if the teacher had seen it, and he said he wasn't sure. And what happens is, so in my opinion, this is kind of a subjective, like when you start having a large pantheon of benevolent deities and wrathful demons, and the wrathful demons are actually protectors of Buddhism and stuff like that, then you're talking about a subjective universe um, that sort of exists in the mind as opposed to existing in an objective reality. But it doesn't matter because I noticed in the meetings of the Kadampa Buddhists in Orlando, and also I forget where, I think it was in Tucson, that at the end they end up doing meditation. And the meditation was a concentration on the breath. And so whatever subjective universe you have, like this practice might dissolve it anyway. So I don't know. But in any case, that is Vajrayana Buddhism, and I don't it's I don't know how to put this, not for me, but that doesn't mean that it's not for you or for somebody else. And I don't think it's any better or worse than anything else. Okay, so another form of Buddhism is Zen Buddhism, which is actually a subsection of Mahayana Buddhism and very popular in the West. And uh, what I've written here is that when Mahayana Buddhism spread to China, it was influenced by Taoism and was referred to as Chan Buddhism. which then was introduced to Japan and developed further and was referred to as Zen Buddhism. It places a strong emphasis on meditation and mindfulness. It is anti-conceptual, but ironically has a great deal of writings on the subject. So they're they're anti-conceptual, and they have written a great deal about being anti-conceptual. Um, the, this is a this is a place where they mostly just practice meditation. I like I like Zen Buddhism, and uh, if I'm in an area where Zen Buddhists meet, I like to meet with them and meditate with them. And it's a good thing because, meditating in a group has an advantage because when you're in the group, you don't have the option of stopping and getting some ice cream out of the freezer or something like that. There's fewer distractions, and you're sort of disciplined that you're going to sit for a certain amount of time till somebody rings the bell, get you out of it. Uh, so, I had an interesting experience with. I was in El Paso, and the the head of a Zen center there, and I was just talking to him, and I said I like Zen Buddhism because there seems to be less bullshit. And and then he got very stern and said there is no bullshit in Zen Buddhism. And I thought, okay, well, maybe a little, but in any case, uh, I like Zen Buddhism. They don't they they're very accepting of, you don't have to buy into their subjective universe in order to meet with them and practice, because in the heart of it, they're anti-conceptual anyway. So they don't really care what you think. Um, but they do have some subjective views of the universe. So anyway, so that's Zen Buddhism. Oh, and there's two schools of Zen Buddhism. Uh, I'm trying to think. There's Soto Zen, and I can't think of the other one. It begins with an R. I don't know, but there's another school of Zen, and like I mentioned earlier, one believes that enlightenment is gradual, and the other believes that it's sort of instantaneous. Um, so anyway, that's Zen. If you can find a Zen center near where you are, it's a great place to learn to meditate. Uh, they mostly do the meditation that I like, which is, you know, concentrating on the breath. So um, that's good. Now, there's another branch of Mahayana Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism. And in Asia, it's a very popular form of Buddhism, and it kind of reminds me of Christianity in a sense because the emphasis is not to become enlightened in this life, but rather to have good ethics, prayers, and spiritual practices that will lead to rebirth in heaven, or in a place they call the Buddha realm, where enlightenment will then be facilitated because you'll be in an environment that's conducive to becoming enlightened. And so, and it's kind of interesting. It's some of it's formalistic. So if you repeat the name of the Buddha, there's a Buddha who's supposed to come in the future, and there's all different Buddhas, like, you know, of different realms. All these different Buddhas have different realms. and I forget the name of the one, but if you repeat their name 10 times, then you're going to be born in their realm, and so you get enlightened in the next life or something. So um, anyway, so again, seems to involve a subjective reality that may or may not align with an objective reality. But who's to say that something's bad if you have a subjective reality and it makes you live a calmer, more peaceful, happier life, then who's to say that that's wrong? So, and who's to say that they don't get reborn in some Buddha realm and get enlightened? But that that brings me to the last group on my list, and this is secular Buddhism. And I guess if I had to describe myself, I'd probably say I'm a secular Buddhist, um, which means that not really that interested in the religious aspects of Buddhism and the beliefs. Um, and let's just see what I wrote, because this was a couple months ago that I wrote this before I fell on my head and ended up with 2 trips to the hospital and brain surgery. So, um, and I was kind of hoping that getting hit on the head there was a guy named Mayor Baba who got hit on the head and became realized, had God realization. And I was hoping that that would happen to me. But with me, it was more like a giant headache. So anyway, but I'm doing much better. So that's good. So it was a couple of months ago I wrote this, so I'm going to be reading it, curious what it was that I wrote about secular Buddhism. And here's what it said. Clearly, as Buddhism spread, it was influenced by different religions and cultures that it encountered. For example, Taoism in China and the Bon religion in Tibet and Hinduism in India. Um, this is this is natural and also occurred in Christianity, which was influenced by converted Druids who contributed to current Christmas and Easter celebration. All the different branches of Buddhism have spread to the West, where they have to some degree been influenced by humanist and scientific thought. And in the West, there is also a new branch of Buddhism that is referred to as secular Buddhism. Secular Buddhists generally have a humanist approach to ethics and forego supernatural worldviews, mythical stories, and consider meditation as a practical and beneficial psychological practice. And it says here, so this is something like you make a commitment like months ago and then you're not sure if you're going to meet it. So in my next talk, I will discuss secular Buddhism and how to some degree it conforms with early Buddhist teachings. Now, I'm not sure that I am going to do a talk about secular Buddhism, but I also uh, put here a link to um, secularbuddhism.com, and it's secular Buddhism is all one word, and .com. So there's some web page. Let's see. I'll bounce over there, see what they say. I'm using a new form of note taking called Obsidian. Well, it's new to me, and I'm not sure how to I've got these links to the web, and I assume there's some way of just getting on it by clicking, but I'll copy it and go. So let's see uh, what that web page on secular Buddhism is. So, and I think I'll let you guys go look at secular Buddhism. And so it starts with this thing, secular Buddhism, a path to inner peace. Uh, and it says, what you'll discover here are concepts, teachings, practices, and ideas. Don't think of them as truths that you're meant to believe. Think of them as tools that are meant to help you live more skillfully. Not every tool will work for every person or situation. Use the tools that work best for you and leave the others in your mental toolkit in case you ever need them. Okay, well, I think that's enough, and I'll let you go explore uh, this area. They got in big red letters. We don't have the answers. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, and also they've got they've got four statements here. You are the guru, so um, I like that. And these are just tools. So this is not supposed to be something you believe in, something you practice, which is something I mentioned before. I wonder if I got it from this page. And then it's about unlearning, and they've got a quote here from Alan Watts. A scholar tries to learn something every day. A student of Buddhism tries to unlearn something every day. Yeah, I guess so, but whatever. And then the fourth comment they have here is uncertainty is reality. Yeah, and I'll definitely go along with that. In any case, this has gone long, and so I'm going to end this here. And like I said, you can go pick this up. Uh, it's secularbuddhism.com. And secular Buddhism is all one word. So secularbuddhism.com. You can go look at this webpage and have a great day. And I'll see you all later. Bye bye.